It's been a long year, but alas, the 2024 United States presidential election is upon us. And wow, this one has gone in a bunch of different directions. Coming out of the 2022 midterms, it was widely believed that we were in for a rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And for over a year, that was very much the case, being solidified when both won their nominations again fairly easily. But then the June 27th presidential debate happened, throwing a wrench in so much. Joe Biden's performance displayed something that had been vastly underplayed and covered up by him and his aides for a long time, which was that he had severely declined mentally. I mean, you could barely comprehend what he was saying. And because of this, polling data showed that his support was bleeding out rapidly. And following the debate, Trump began to just walk away with an increasing lead nationally and in the swing states. And mind you, even without this debate performance, Biden's approval rating had been abysmally low already, dropping from the low 40s to the 30s, primarily because of inflation under his watch, whether he deserved blame for that or not. And this decline was made worse by his handling of the conflict between Israel and Palestine since last October. And just about on every issue, voters disapprove of Joe Biden. And because of all of this adding up, he was essentially forced to drop out of the race on July 21st, which is when Donald Trump versus Joe Biden Part 2 turned into Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. Overnight, the presidential election looked went from what was looking like a Trump lead of 3.3 points to 5 points, basically turned into a tie with the momentum going to Kamala Harris. Democrats finally had a reason to be enthusiastic with a nominee that wasn't as old. And I say this because she's 60. I mean, she's still a baby boomer, but in American politics, that's basically like you just turned 18 now. So, voters who were not wanting to vote for an 82-year-old as president with severe cognitive decline, sticking it out till he was 86 if he had won, well, they started to come back to the party. And because of this, Kamala Harris saw a surge in the race against Trump, but also in her own favorability, which had been pretty low before. And this momentum would continue up until the DNC, where after this, she really opened the lead on Trump. Um, Not just nationally, but many swing states. Georgia and Arizona, where Trump had surged massively before, were once again tied. And the Rust Belt states that are needed for either candidate to win turned into Kamala Harris clear leads. And then, after the September 10 debate, it was pretty clear she was the favorite in the race, which was pretty bad for Donald Trump. Not an unfamiliar place for him to be in, but maybe unfamiliar in the context of how the race had been going up until now, where he was leading until it became him versus her. But unfortunately for Kamala Harris, I really think the September 10 debate was her peak. Because, I mean, you see, there were always a few key issues for her from the start. The first and most obvious to one to me that was that she really wasn't running on anything. I mean, she didn't have a policy section on her website until literally 2 nights before the debate. So the election came down to vibes, which, maybe works when the environment favors you, but that's not always reliable. Biden is still unpopular, and the issues in the country are still being blamed on the administration that you are the vice president of. So a vibes based election with no policy can become deadly to you. And then when she started having more interviews, it became super clear that her campaign, which seemed like a breath of fresh air and hope, change, a brand new glorious era, it didn't really have much substance once you looked under the hood. You know, she really really, it's really telling. A very telling moment for her was when she was asked what would be different in her administration, and she couldn't answer how she would be different from Biden. And in one of the times she was asked this, she just said that she didn't. So, great answer, Kamala. I mean, like, saying you won't be different from the unpopular president is how you're going to win over voters that don't like him. That's the golden rule in politics. And once this started to become clear, down went that big favorability bump, just a bit, not entirely, but went back underwater when it was a net positive, and the race came back down to a statistical tie. But Kamala Harris is one half of this election. So let's talk about the big man himself, Donald Trump. So, Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign has been interesting. At first, when it was primary season, I thought and it looked like he was going to run something similar to his 2016 campaign. The economic populism that sold him to so many voters, that kind of stuff. But no, not really. He really learned nothing from why he lost in 2020, which I guess is kind of obvious. I mean, he doesn't even accept that he lost still. Trump is very clearly riding on super serving his base and, just leaning into just seeming very fringe. And he's also not as energetic and entertaining as he was in his last two runs. But hey, he's got enough support to be competitive in an election, much as people may want to disagree. I mean, he won in 2016, and even when he lost in 2020, he was much more competitive than anyone was expecting, and he got 11 million more votes than the first time he ran. And that's a very rare thing to do, not just when you lose an election the second time, but as an incumbent president in general. And I think Trump was probably always a favorite in this environment, not because of him, but because a Republican was always going to be kind of a default favorite in this environment. Because, again, unpopular president. But a few things blunted Trump's momentum. And the first thing was the fact that in April and May he couldn't campaign because he was on trial after getting arrested about 258 times. And this started to hurt him against Biden. And then he was found guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records, which really hurt his standing as much as many people want to think that that somehow helps him. We saw how that worked with Hillary Clinton, and in her case, she was just under investigation and never indicted. But many people view you as corrupt when you are in court or on trial or being investigated legally in any way. When there's smoke, there's fire. All of June, Trump started to lose ground in the polls leading up to that debate. But he caught two key breaks. The first was, of course, Biden showing the world how far he'd mentally declined. But the second and most important one was the attempted assassination on him. He saw a very noticeable boost in favorability and in polling, and at least in favorability that's held up. He is now more popular than he ever was in 2016 or 2020. He's still unpopular, but it is not anywhere near the low levels that it was the last two runs. And this should have really been a great time for him, and it was until Joe Biden dropped out and Kamala Harris became his new opponent, and he was really unable to formulate a strategy against her. And added to this, he and his VP pick kept having many embarrassing moments and blunders. His grip was loosening up, and the momentum that he built up for quite a while, it seemed to peter out. And this held up through the debate, where his insane comments on Haitian migrants uh, eating cats went viral, and this hurt him even more. But Trump has somewhat managed to form more coherent attacks on Harris recently, mainly pointing out that she represents the status quo of the last 4 years that Americans don't like, and bringing back the aesthetic of populism in his speeches. Bar the fact that, like Harris, he doesn't really have any substance to his cause of change. He's also running on vibes. This is Trump. But some of the charm he's managed to bring back And because of this, that helped this poll numbers improve somewhat. And honestly, even though it's a tie at this moment, when at many times it has not been, I always have leaned on the idea that this race was going to be close. I never bought into the thought that Trump would beat Biden by a landslide. He's just way too polarizing. For as many people love him and adore him, many people despise him. So that was always in my mind. But on the same token, when Harris stepped into the picture, her surge, I feel like it had a relative ceiling. I viewed her rise initially as mostly a regaining of lost support rather than Trump himself losing support. Trump hasn't really gone super down in polls as much as Democrats leaning voters who were walking away from Biden came back for Harris. And that's why when she peaked, that didn't continue to grow. And in the swing states, things are similar. Kamala Harris was at one point leading in Georgia and Arizona, and even North Carolina, the third of these states, Trump won in 2020. But that's changed. Trump has managed to regain the advantage in all three states. And Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where Harris was leading more prevalently, Trump has closed the gap to make them ties. Nevada is also a tie, but we're going to get more into that later. As it stands, this election is most likely going to be close. And heading into the final stretch, it's hard to say either candidate has more momentum than the other if either of them have momentum at all right now. Favorability wise, they're both underwater. One a little bit more than the other, and the country has become increasingly polarized. So, with all that being said, what is my prediction? Let's get into that. So, let's start off with Georgia and Arizona. These states are key. They're two of the states that Trump won in 2016 but lost in 2020. And polling did show Kamala Harris competitive in August. Again, she really had a surge, but that's changed. Trump is leading in both of them, and the leads are starting to convince me somewhat. And I now think that Trump is going to win both of them back. I'm more confident in Georgia than in Arizona because Trump is ahead by a little bit more there, and Georgia has more Republican friendly voters there. But again, I think both Georgia and Arizona look like they'll go back to Trump. And as these go, so we're North Carolina. Kamala Harris is competitive here, but again, the momentum is waned. Democrats every 4 years since Obama won it in 2008 have come up just short. And I don't think it's going to be a big win for Trump, but he'll probably win it within 1 to 3 points. So now to Nevada. I neglected to mention this before for a good reason. This is a state Republicans constantly feel they're competitive in. Kind of similar story to North Carolina. And they have a good reason to feel that. In 2016, Trump lost it by 4.5 points, and then in 2020, he managed to come closer, losing it by only 2.5 points that time. But Nevada has a stubborn Democrat edge that Republicans just haven't been able to chip away at enough to win. And we saw this in 2022 when Adam Laxalt barely lost the Senate race there. And because of this, even though the polls show a tie, I think Kamala Harris is probably going to win it by roughly 1 to 2 points. And that brings us to three states you probably know way too much if you've been following politics since 2016: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These are where I believe the race is going to be settled. Let's start with the easiest state of the three for me to predict: Michigan. So, starting off, this is a state with a lot of question marks to it that you should keep in mind. The Israel Palestine conflict causing Democrats to see erosion among Arabs and Muslims will be felt here more than any other state if that has an effect. Michigan has a larger amount of Arabs than any of the other states that are competitive this election. However, Democrats have improved a lot in Michigan since Trump won it in 2016, and they have a phenomenal ground game there. Republicans have kind of fallen off there. And because of this, I think Kamala Harris will win Michigan, holding the Biden win in 2020. It will probably be closer than 2020, which was a 3 point win than Biden, but I think Kamala Harris will hang on to it. That's my prediction. Again, keep your eye on that question mark because you never know how that's going to play out, but I'm I'm kind of confident she's going to win it. In fact, this is the state I'm most confident about in predicting out of any of the other states. Next up is Wisconsin, a state much more rural, older, and white than Michigan. The closest of the three key Rust Belt states in 2020. Again, very, very hard to predict. There's a good ground game from Democrats, and Tim Walz being the VP pick next door in Minnesota, he's a rural old white guy. I think that aesthetic is going to work there, and I think it will help Kamala Harris barely hold Wisconsin. But like Michigan, keep your eye on this one because it likes to play tricks. Biden plus 17 ABC goofballs. That was a terrible miss you guys had. And alas, the state that will make or break this election Pennsylvania, the state that every poll shows is tied, or just about every poll. The state both candidates have spent the most money and resources in. This one is hard to predict. What's interesting about this one is that this really has all the demographics in play in this election working class white voters, suburban women, Latino voters, and black voters, even that education gap. At this current moment, the data seems to indicate no matter who wins, it's going to be incredibly close. So, who do I think edges it out with all of the data we are presented with? At this current moment, it appears that it points to a very, very small, minuscule, razor thin, nail biting, ultrafine Donald Trump win. And with that win, my prediction is that Donald Trump will win the election with 281 electoral votes to 257 for Kamala Harris, making him the 47th president of the United States. But here's the thing about this something that I believe in my gut is possible and has a good chance of being the case. And it all goes back to 2022 when Roe v. Wade was overturned. The moment exit polls came out on election night in the midterms, abortion was a surprisingly high issue, considering it had happened months ago. It was the second most important issue to voters, behind inflation. It was much closer to inflation than a lot of people were expecting. And the red wave Republicans had been wish casting had been wish casted away within a few hours after that. This provides Kamala Harris with a lifeline. If abortion is an issue in the top two, I think the equation changes and Pennsylvania could go her way and maybe even other states. Donald Trump's path to victory relies on voters prioritizing the economy and immigration over everything else. It really becomes much harder for Trump to win this election if abortion is in the top two. So, if abortion manages to be a more important issue than expected after 2 years, I believe Kamala Harris will win the election with 276 electoral votes to 261 for Donald Trump. So basically, be ready for anything. As for the worst case scenarios, or the best case scenarios for either or, I think for Donald Trump, the best outcome for him is 312 electoral votes to 226 for Kamala Harris. And the best outcome for Kamala Harris is 319 electoral votes to 219 for Donald Trump. These are each candidate's best case scenarios. And I think they're unlikely to happen. If anyone is predicting these outcomes as their official predictions, just know that they are only saying this because they really support one of those candidates, the one who they think is going to win, and they want that candidate to win, and they're trying to wish cast it. Beware anyone who says that. They do not base that off of anything other than what they want to see happen. So that's my 2024 election prediction. In a few days, we'll know who comes out of this the winner. Take care and have a wonderful day. Hold up. Okay. So, new update has just come out, and if you're watching this video once it's been released and you know a lot about the election and you follow polls closely, you probably know what update I'm about to give you. So, Ann Seltzer, who does polls for Des Moines Register, an Iowa newspaper, just polled Iowa, and it shows Kamala Harris up 3 points on Donald Trump in Iowa. She is a very reliable pollster, and in 2016 and 2020, she predicted Donald Trump would easily win Iowa by 7 to 9 points. And she was one of the few ones who was correct. Um, this is really interesting, and this actually kind of derails everything I just predicted because now I have no idea what's gonna happen. And either she caught something or like she caught a trend that no one else has caught yet, or she was like she really missed. There's a lot to consider in this, so yeah, that's so that changes the equation a bit. I want to say that now. So I don't think Donald Trump is going to lose Iowa, but now I'm less confident he's going to win Iowa by a convincing margin. So my guess now is that Trump is probably in worse position than I expected, and um I think I am going to say that I actually think my prediction of Kamala Harris winning the election, it seems more closer to reality than anything else. So, yeah, but I made this prediction, so I kind of have to stick with it. So, this is still more what you should expect, but because of that poll, I am more bullish on Kamala Harris than I was before I finished writing this and recording and editing it. So, yeah, just a couple more days until the election. Take care.